We're honored to be hosting our three distinguished guests this evening to participate in a frank and important discussion about gun violence in America. Seamus McGraw, author of From a Taller Tower, is a journalist and frequent contributor to the New York Times op-ed page. He does not shy away from complex and difficult topics. His previous books deal with issues ranging from fracking to climate change. In conversation with Seamus this evening is Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. In 2012, he was the youngest member elected to the US Senate, and since the Newtown school shooting that same year, has become best known as a leader confronting gun violence in the US. His book, The Violence Inside Us, deals with this very issue. And last but certainly not least, we are pleased to welcome State Senator Bob Duff. Re-elected to the state Senate in 2020, he was chosen by his Senate colleagues in 2015, 2017, and 2019 to serve as Senate Majority Leader. Under his leadership, the Senate Democratic Caucus passed legislation standing up for Dreamers, the national popular vote, healthcare access, gun safety, LGBTQ rights, equal pay for equal work, among other great efforts. We're truly thankful to have such knowledgeable panelists joining us this evening to tackle such an important issue as gun violence. And so without further ado, please welcome Seamus McGraw and Senators Chris Murphy and Bob Duff.
Thank you very much for having us. Let me begin for a moment by just making a quick statement. I'm honored to be joined by these two gentlemen today who are leaders in, I think, what is one of the most critical issues facing the country today and going forward. And I am deeply grateful to RJ Julia for giving us this opportunity. I'd like to make this more than just about the four corners of my book. I'd like to make this kind of a wide-ranging discussion about the challenges that we face at the moment. Before I do, though, I want to make a quick point, and that is I don't view a book as the end of a conversation. I view it as the beginning of a conversation. And I don't view these sorts of events as being as bound by time as they tend to be. So if you look at the chat box, my contact information, my phone number, my email address, where I can be reached on Facebook and Twitter is there, because I implore you to continue the conversation after this part of it ends. That said, I think one of the reasons that I was so eager to do this event, to do an event in Connecticut, is because in a great many ways, Connecticut has been a real leader, a real model for the rest of the country in how it's risen to the challenge of controlling gun violence. In Senator Murphy's book, he makes it abundantly clear that the issues of gun violence intersect in a great many ways. We tend to focus, understandably, on mass public shootings because they are the sorts of things that ripple across the entire society. But many of the factors that are at play in our mass public shootings are at play in other forms of gun violence. Many of the responses could have a significant impact, and in some cases already have, on other forms of gun violence. I'd like to start actually by asking Senator Duff to kind of sketch out, because I know that among some of our viewers are people who are not from Connecticut and may not be really aware of how much leadership has been shown in the state of Connecticut. To talk to us a little bit about not just the Sandy Hook bill, but about how that developed and about what the results have been, and not just in terms of mass shootings, but in terms of reducing other forms of gun violence.
Right. Well, thank you, Seamus. I really appreciate it. And it's a real pleasure to be on here with you and to talk about your book, and to be on with Chris Murphy, my friend who we served in the legislature together, who has taken such a national prominence in this fight in the United States Senate and in our Congress, and to really bring it all together on how all of us can make a difference when it comes to reducing gun violence, whether it's through policy or whether it's through books or actions or whatever it is. But your book is really lays it out well, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I would say that, you know, for us here in Connecticut, and you talked about it in chapter 3, I believe, about Sandy Hook, and you spent a whole chapter on that and the killer and all of that work, and what happened that day, and subsequently what we looked at. But behind the scenes, after that terrible incident, and I know it shook us all to the core across this country. I will say here in Connecticut, it's a small state, 3.5 million people. I live probably about 40 minutes away. At the time, my kids were in elementary school. I know Senator Murphy's kids were young as well. And I knew our principal at the time of our elementary school had a kid who had gone there, daughter who had gone there, and one of the other teachers in the school where my kids went, his kids were in the school at that time. And I had one of my acquaintances was the assistant principal there who was actually injured. So it was, for us, it was almost like another 9/11. It was deeply, deeply personal, and it shook us all in the sense that we all felt like we had to do something. Just a horrific day. And so thanks to the efforts of Governor Malloy at the time and legislative leaders, we put together a bipartisan bill that dealt with a number of things. And it was gun safety, it was mental health, and it was school security, 3 different buckets in that one bill. And I, as I said to you earlier before we came on, I really view that vote as one of the most meaningful votes that I've cast in the legislature. And that, there was a lot of scare tactics used leading up to that vote on whether or not it was actually going to do anything, whether it would reduce crime or increase crime, whether it was going to, have any kind of effect whatsoever. And so what we've seen over the years since that, it actually has had a very positive effect, in addition to the other steps we've taken, such as temporary restraining orders and fixing that, and our gun storage laws, and not having and banning ghost guns and those types of things. So, those are the things that I know that Senator Murphy would like to do. I know that there's only so much Congress would do, but here in Connecticut, we've been fortunate, and we have other states around us who have tough gun laws as well. So we're fortunate that way. But I would just say that for us here in Connecticut, it's not only just about what happened in Sandy Hook, it's also what happens in our inner cities. Absolutely. And we just had a shooting of a 3-year-old and a teenager, and they're both dead. And so in that bill also was a program called Project Longevity, which helps fight violence in our inner cities. We've got to fund those things more. So it just can't be what happens in the suburbs. It's got to be the suburbs, the cities, and the rural areas. And that's where we all have to focus on these things. But, the mass shootings is what gets the attention, but we have to look at gun violence in its entirety as well.
Senator Murphy, that's something Senator Murphy, that's something you touch on a great deal, actually, in your book. When we talk about, when you talk about, for example, Sam Saylor and Sean Oliver, you talk about the interconnectivity between the issues of the issues we tend to focus on gun violence, and the impact that they have on communities. One of the things that Senator Duff has talked about is that for, New Haven's still along the Iron Corridor. One of the things that Senator Duff has talked about is that as effective as the steps that have been taken in Connecticut may have been, and may be proving to be, they can never be wholly effective until it happens nationally. You recently sat down with Politico, and one of the things that came through in that discussion when I read it was a sense of optimism for the long run, a sense of hope. How can you be hopeful?
Well, first of all, honored to be part of this discussion. And Seamus, thank you for your just incredible contribution to, I think, our nation's struggle to understand this very unique epidemic of mass shootings. And I'm eager to turn the questions to you very quickly to really hear more about how you can help policy leaders like Bob and I sort through this. Well, I mean, listen, I'm hopeful because what we have been missing for most of the last 30 years is political power. The NRA was very good and very innovative in building up a political machine that was able, implausibly, to be able to win victories for positions held by 10% of the population, and was able to deliver a blow in 2013 to a background checks bill that was supported by 90% of the population. That's an extraordinary political achievement. But that's all it is, a political achievement, right? We didn't lose the argument. We just didn't have the political power that we needed to. So that's what we've been doing over the last 8 years, is really, building that political power. And it is true, and I love your sort of take on this. It is true that the nation pays attention to the epidemic of gun violence when there's a mass shooting, and there's good and bad reasons for that. There's obviously, it's due in large part to the fact that the media has decided that there are ratings that come with covering these shootings in a way that don't by covering others. But it's also because these mass shootings of strangers, in particular, are terrifying because it all of a sudden gives everyone, no matter where you live and how safe you believe you are, a sense that they are constantly in danger and that their kids are constantly in danger. So you can understand why these mass shootings of strangers evoke emotions all over the country. But I will say, having literally just come from spending the afternoon with the mother of that 3-year-old boy, I live in Hartford. And so I spent a good part of the day with my neighbors in the north end of Hartford talking about that shooting and others. They're furious. They're furious that, well, that shooting of the 3-year-old boy made headlines beyond Connecticut. Almost none of the other murders do. And we've got to find a way to, get the country to pay attention at moments when there aren't mass shootings. But the fact of the matter is, the political movement that we've built up, now is gotten to the point where, a lot of my Republican colleagues, and I don't mean to be too political about it, Seamus, but a lot of my Republican colleagues are now kind of like weighing whether they sort of fear the gun lobby or the anti-gun violence movement more. And that was not the case 5 years ago. They knew they feared the gun lobby more. So now, it's a balancing act that they're doing. And that gives me hope that maybe we can, get something done.
Do you think there's also a generational thing going on, Senator? And what I mean by that is, as I point out in the book, I'm a gun owner. All right. There is not a day that goes by between the middle of October and the end of January when I don't have a gun in my hand. Now, to be fair, it's a flintlock most of the time. I carry the weapon that the Second Amendment explicitly gives me the right to carry, I argue. But there is literally hardly a day that goes by during those 4 months of the year when I don't have a gun in my hand. I have 4 kids. They range in age from 16 to 31. Not one of them picks up a gun. Because whereas I grew up with the idea that a gun was a tool, and yes, to some degree, a cultural totem, to them, it's a cultural totem of a foreign tribe. Mm. It's a cultural totem to a group to which they do not belong. I'm a big believer in the idea that demographics are destiny. And I have a feeling that, and I'd like to know whether you share this with me, that there is a shift going on, a generational shift, a cultural shift. That 10% that you talk about, maybe it's that now. Will it be that 2 years from now? Will it be half that in 5?
Yeah, you're dealing with the active shooter drill generation, right? This is a group of kids who are maturing, all of which don't know anything other than every single year doing a drill in their school where they're, locked in a bathroom or told to hide under their desks. And there's no way that doesn't end up having an impact on you. And the data, of course, would tell you that we're going through this sort of very, very strange long-term shift, right? In which fewer and fewer households have guns, right? 1980, half of American households have a gun. Today, that number is about 1/3, and it's going down. But we have more guns in America than ever before. So you've got 3% of Americans who are buying half the guns in the country. And many of those guns are sort of finding their way into illegal circulation. How can't you have guns sliding into illegal circulation when you have record numbers of purchases? But it's a small group of people who are doing it. And so I do think, we are entering an era in which less people will own guns, more people will have an acute, very personal experience, whether it's knowing somebody or just having gone through one of those drills, about the power of those guns. And, again, I sort of make the case that it's not a question of if, it's just a question of when, we have the ability to do something about it at a national level.
I think there's also a cultural shift that comes as a result of sort of how hyper-connected and at the same time isolated we are. That I think may also be influencing that. One of the things about the high-profile mass public shootings is that ever since August 1st, 1966, at the tower at the University of Texas, these have been instantaneous national experiences. Right. And because of that, the trauma, and I talk about this a fair amount in my book, and you do in yours as well, Senator, the idea that this trauma is transmitted in real time. There's a story I tell in the book about a young man by the name of Teller Fanos, who had survived the slaughter at the Mandalay Bay Hotel in Las Vegas, the shooting from the taller tower, only to be slaughtered about a year later, 2 miles from his home at the borderline in yet another mass shooting. His parents were asleep. They're wonderful people, Mark and Susan Orfanos, courageous people. His parents were asleep in bed at the time of the shooting, 2 miles away, when they were awakened by a telephone call from a relative on the East Coast who had seen it. The immediacy of the trauma spread across the country. When they reached Tell's body, there were 1,000 text messages on his telephone. 1,000 people touched in real time by the trauma of that atrocity. Multiply that by every casualty of every mass shooting across the country, and you begin to get a sense of how broad that national trauma is. To what degree, and this is a question for both of you, to what degree does the fact that we have been experiencing now a half century of national trauma create a desire for change? And to what degree does it create an obstacle to change? Because in times of trauma, as we saw during the first months of the pandemic, when gun sales spiked, in times of trauma, we tend to cling to our guns. That's a question for both of you. To what degree is it a catalyst for change, and to what degree is it an obstacle to change?
That's really that's a very good question, and you know, it's tough to answer, because it seems like in these times you have to wonder how much, when we hear of these stories, and is some of them are far away, some of them are closer, and you know, you localize them, but I guess how much of it actually does traumatize people when they're looking at this, and then how much does it actually cause people to really just kind of hold on to their own and say, the rest of the world is out here, I'm just holding on to my, you know, my tribe here in my house. And so I think personally on this issue that there is just such a frustration amongst the American people that that there hasn't been collectively the political will, whether it's in state legislatures or federally, to really tackle this issue. That I wonder how people view that as to how they are thinking about their own survival on this, or their family's survival, and that this is such a solvable problem. And as I said to you earlier, that, you know, if other states or our Congress would just do some of what Connecticut has done, which I know Senator Murphy supports, and we could take great steps in reducing gun violence across the country. There's no secret sauce, there's no magic formula, and we can provide some safety to the American people, and health, because the mental health and the toll this takes on people, to your point of 1,000 text messages. I think of even a few years ago when my younger son was still in elementary school, and somebody thought that they heard a gunshot, which they probably didn't, but maybe they did, who knows, because behind him was a park, so maybe, you know, wooded and everything else, maybe somebody was shooting off a BB gun. He had to get behind the bookshelf for 45 minutes with his friends, you know, crammed in there, because this is what they do during active shooter drills. Nobody should have to go through that in this day and age, and especially a 10-year-old. So that's what I think, is that frustration that's out there, and based on the frustration that's out there, how do then people react, and how do they I guess, justify that frustration into some of their own actions? That to me is the question. I don't know if that's an answer for you or not, Seamus, but that's.
I think that does answer the question. One of the things I'm fascinated by, and again, this is something that Senator Murphy explores to a degree in his book, and I try to explore in mine, are the larger societal costs of trauma. We can talk, for example, about your son being forced to hide behind a bookshelf and how that's going to haunt him to some degree. These are formative years. This is what he sees in his formative years. My children going through these lockdown drills, but even beyond that, you know, there's a story I tell from your own state, from that pivotal moment from Sandy Hook, about a veteran police officer, a trained police officer, one of the first officers inside that building, inside that room, a veteran police officer, so overwhelmed by what he saw that when he was questioned about it later, he insisted that he had not been in that room. There's an impact on that, and we all bear the cost of that. The officer in Texas, outside of Santa Fe High School, forced into a prone position while inside his own mother lay dying, a substitute teacher. That's something we haven't asked of our soldiers since at least the Civil War, and we're asking it of our first responders. What's the impact of that? What's the societal cost of that? Let's take it a step further. There is, and Senator Murphy, this again is something you address in your wonderful book. There is shot through not just in the way we discuss violence, but in the conditions that lead in many cases to its creation and in the ways we respond to it. Sort of a national miasma of, let's call it what it is, institutional racism. And that's something that's going to take us lifetimes to address, because it's taken us lifetimes to get here. But we have seen incidents of police violence in recent years, in recent days, that seem to me to in some way be driven by fear. Not just the irrational fear of racism, but the rational fear, a rational fear, that any response is a response taken in a country awash in guns. Police officers often do have a legitimate fear for their life, maybe just not from the stop they're making. And so we see errors in judgment. We see mistakes. We sometimes see other things as well. Without addressing the overwhelming number of firearms and the legitimate risk that police officers face, regardless of where they stop. It seems to me that one problem sort of feeds into the other. These are things we could address. Senator?
Yeah, no, yeah, listen, being a police officer is a, job I'd never want. You see people at their worst and their most vulnerable. And, there's no doubt that has an impact often on sort of how you see the world and how you perceive threats. It is not an explanation nor a justification for
exactly
what we have seen. It is always important, though, to sort of put yourself in the position of others. Seamus, I just don't think you can talk enough about race when you're talking about the phenomenon of American gun violence. And we can talk about the ways in which violence has been used historically to by white Americans to oppress mostly Black Americans, but now, Black and brown Americans. But you also sort of have to talk about race and you do this in your book, when you look at the profile of the mass shooter, or whether you look at the epidemic of suicide in this nation, right? It's just a unmistakable difference when you look at the victims of the people who are pulling the trigger when it comes to the homicide epidemic, the people who are pulling the trigger when it comes to the suicide epidemic, and the people who are pulling the trigger when it comes to the mass shooting epidemic. Very different. Yep. And there's a racial component to all of it, right? You sort of talk about in your book about how the mass shooters, they don't all have grievances, but many of them do. Many of them sort of perceive themselves to have sort of fallen from the place in which they believe they should have been in society. That is sort of Emile Durkheim's theory of suicide, the idea that you have become dislocated from your social position, and thus suicide is something you see in white America, mainly in male white America. You don't see suicide rates at that level in Black America. You don't see it amongst women who, for all the wrong reasons, sort of have come to be more, unfortunately, regularized with their position in American society versus where white Americans are. And so, it's really hard not to talk about race, and we're terrible as a country at talking about race. We're so afraid of it. But you have to have that. You have to have that conversation when you're talking about every category here, including the mass shootings.
And I think you hit a very, very good point there, Senator. And I think there's another point that goes along with it. Even when we have the sort of exception to the rule in terms of mass shootings, for example, you have something that, this may be an indelicate way of putting it, but sort of a dominant white mythology that's applied over it. There was a shooting in 1991 at the University of Iowa in which 5 people were massacred. Okay. The shooter in that case was a student from China who ultimately took his own life. When they found his notebook after the shooting, he had written this phrase: "Cowboy justice is the only action against corporate crime." Cowboy justice. The person may not have been born in America, and certainly wasn't born an aggrieved white male in America. But that's become such a pervasive part of our national identity that I think it was easy to assume. You talk about the slaughter at Simon's Rock College, not all that far from you guys, in the 90s. Again, didn't fit the standard idea that we have of who a mass shooter is, except that in that case, the shooter embraced that same ethos. There's a movie you talk about in your book, Senator, Red Dawn, and what that represents kind of to American culture. That was his favorite movie. This killer, by the way, said something that I thought was absolutely fascinating to me. And I think it kind of goes to the heart of this. Now, I want to make this clear. He explained to me repeatedly that he wasn't saying this as a justification, that he was simply commenting on the culture in which this occurred. The guy claims to take responsibility for his actions. He claims to be remorseful. It's above my pay grade to determine whether or not he's being honest. I'll leave that to the reader. But at one point, I asked him, I said, would a good guy with a gun have stopped you? And his response, which I think was telling and insightful, whether it was true or not, was, I thought I was the good guy with the gun. I think until we address that in the culture at large, there's an entire class of these atrocities that we're never going to be able to fully contain. But I think there are steps we can take in the meantime. And again, I think the two of you, and it's the reason I'm honored to be here, are both people who have taken tremendous steps in that direction. We ain't there yet, but we're getting there, I think. I kind of agree with you, Senator. I am also more optimistic than I may sound.
Well, I'll just say this and eager for Bob's thoughts. I mean, you sort of mentioned at the opening of your book about, you know, the rise of the sort of modern mass shooter is probably not coincidental to the rise of the internet age, in which you can find a sort of community for your grievance very easily. And so a set of feelings that you're having, which without connection to others that may share that misogyny or that sort of that racist sentiment, you know, may be hard to sort of justify into action, but you can find that. And, you know, our killer in Newtown obviously had found a community online that was, you know, willing to share in his sort of more broadly leveled societal grievances, and layer that on top of the sort of narcissism that is present in many of these shooters, and some would argue is more present today in sort of aging generations than it was years ago. And it's it's a really dangerous combination.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And you talked a lot about narcissism in your book as well. I just want to bring up a point that you know, we talk, I think generally, and you spoke in your book about it too. But I think as you talked about the shooters, that a lot of times there wasn't a lot of outward signs that this person would become a mass shooter. There wasn't always like that kind of somebody fits in a box, or they check that box, and that somehow we know that this person is going to be the next, you know, shooter who goes in a supermarket or a school or a library or a movie theater or whatever. So I think the question becomes for us as policymakers is, you know, so what do we do? Because what ends up happening is you end up hearing the same old tired arguments. I had written on my Facebook page when President Biden lowered the flags to half staff, and it's funny, I'm not even sure which mass shooting it was because we've had so many over the last month. And I said, you know, why don't we just leave it at half staff, because we're all kind of sitting ducks until something gets done. And so the folks who are still clinging to the idea that this is all a mental health issue, and certainly we agree that people who do this have mental health problems, but I classify everybody who has a mental health problem as violent is obviously a mistake, and that's discriminatory, and we're not going to put everybody in that box. But it really comes then down to access to the weapons. Mm-hmm. And I think that while Connecticut did have those three buckets of gun laws, stronger gun laws, mental health, and school security, it's really the access to the weapons. Because if the killer in Newtown, or the killer at Virginia Tech, or the killer at the killers at Columbine, or the killer over in Boulder, Colorado, if they didn't have access to these weapons, or we weren't, you know, a very small percentage of people weren't having these guns, and then somehow they end up on the black market somewhere, that would prevent a lot of these shootings. And so, you know, in my opinion, and that's what we did in Connecticut, was we restricted access to these weapons, because it's, you know, any of our amendments are not amendments that that don't have parameters. They all have parameters to them. And so, and the courts have set those parameters, and our law has even been challenged and upheld. And so that's why, you know, if we're going to really think about the mass shooting, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and there's no magic solution. But in my opinion, if we're going to really make our country safer, it's all about access to weapons and rejecting the same old tired arguments that have been used by the NRA and the gun lobby for decade upon decade upon decade. And that's why, you know, I really appreciate Chris, who has literally gone up against them, sometimes by himself. And I know he's grown a coalition, but he's done that on a national stage where it wasn't easy to do, and to go against really a set of and a set of people for decades who have resisted any iota of change, while people have died, you know, hundreds and thousands of people have died along the way needlessly.
I'd love to jump back in. We have a number of questions from our listeners this evening. And Senator Duff, that's actually a perfect segue to one of our questions from a Canadian listener. Like many of their compatriots, they find American gun laws absurdly loose and ineffective. Could gun control measures, which we've already talked about to some extent, Senator Duff, could those measures from other countries like the UK or Australia ever be considered by the US?
You know, we certainly look to, you know, other countries for models, and of course, Canada is a country that, you know, has a lot of firearms. It's a country that, you know, has a long-standing relationship with firearms, and yet they don't have anywhere near the level of violence we do. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of which is that they've just made a commitment to making sure that only law-abiding citizens get their hands on guns, and they've made a different decision about what guns are legally possessible by civilians and what aren't. They are also a country that has decided to have a higher economic floor for their citizens. And so they have sort of less desperation and poverty. And, you know, again, I make the case that you can't tell, the story of American gun violence is a story of access to firearms, poverty, and racism. And we just don't do as well as many of our other high-income nations when it comes to all three of those. In the end, you know, we will have to sort of make our own path, because we've got sort of political dynamics in the United States that are unique, including the sort of power of the gun lobby. So we'll look to other nations, and, you know, I make the argument that on this question of mental illness and its contribution to our epidemic, we should understand that there's no evidence we have more mental illness than other countries. There's no evidence that we spend less money treating mental illness. So it doesn't feel like that is the reason why we have the problem that we have. So we look to other countries, but, you know, I think we probably end up charting our own path here. And that path, you know, quite honestly, right now begins with this issue of, you know, increased background checks.
Absolutely. And so I guess then pivoting, and Seamus, Senator Duff as well, please jump in here. Pivoting to that question about mental health. And we have a question from Lynn, a school principal at the time of Sandy Hook. And you were correct about it feeling like another 9/11, certainly for educators. She herself has a novel coming out in 2 weeks that explores these issues. There's no silver bullet, but along with appropriate and common sense gun laws, can we prioritize hiring more social workers and psychologists in schools? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think Senator Murphy has some thoughts on that also, but I think we've talked a lot about social emotional issues as it relates to kids in schools, and we have to acknowledge the fact that there are a lot of kids who are in trauma right now, and they're in trauma because of racism, because of poverty, because of stressed households, because of the fact that, you know, parents sometimes work 2-3 jobs, and the economic conditions of which they're under. So I think that, you know, not dealing with this issue in totality is a mistake, which is why I keep saying that there's no one issue, no one solution to this issue of mass shootings, though the top thing for me would be access to the weapons. But if we're going to really work to have a country that is healthier, I think that, you know, those kinds of issues and how we help kids who are in crisis is important, especially as it relates to psychologists and social workers in schools.
I couldn't agree more. I think, again, we are talking about a nation awash in trauma. And to the degree that we can address that trauma early, not only is it possible that you're going to turn around and perhaps address the problems that would lead to a mass shooter, but you're also going to address many of the crises that would lead some of these children over time to become victims. And so whether or not we ever see the results of it, I think that's a very worthwhile investment.
Mm-hmm.
Seamus, how do you deal with a broader question of mental illness contribution here? Because I always struggle, you know, I'm pretty firm in how I talk about it. But, you know, I always want to admit that our system of mental health is broken in the country and you should fix it, but you shouldn't fix it and expect to get a return on the gun violence epidemic without doing the other things. But I've begun your book, but haven't finished it. I'm just sort of fascinated as to sort of when somebody says, hey, listen, all these guys are mentally ill. This is a mental illness issue. How do you approach
Well, first of all, that's statistically not true. Okay. Even if we turn around and take the most optimistic numbers, that somewhere around 61 to 67% of them have some diagnosable mental illness. That means that 40% of them don't. Okay. That means that the only diagnosable mental illness they have is being an American in this day. Okay. And so I think turning around and discuss, my concern is this. We do, without question, need to rise to the challenge that we have failed to rise to of addressing an entire array of mental health crises in this country. But all too often when we have this discussion about gun violence, that's not brought up to solve the problem. That's brought up to silence the discussion.
Distraction.
That's brought up to turn around and say, yeah, well, but. That's the thing that I keep going back to through the entire book is we have ways of enforcing that deafening silence between gunshots. And I fear that it's being used as a human shield very often. And the answer to that is to turn around and say, yes, we do need to be better nationally on issues of mental health. But that's not going to solve your gun crisis. You know, I point out in the book that so many, and this is something that Senator Duff sort of alluded to, so many of these shooters show certain behaviors. And we talk about how the behaviors are missed. Well, very often, those behaviors are not significantly different than the behaviors of us at large. Grievance? Hell, we've turned grievance into a national industry in this country. Victimhood? Senator, you talk about this in your book. This sense of victimhood and grievance. It's become a cottage industry in this country. In that fog of war in peacetime, in that dense fog of grievance and victimhood, how am I really supposed to peer out the silhouette in the fog that's carrying an AR-15?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I think
our Canadian friend's question.
Yeah, and I think, Seamus, I think that's it's nail on the head. I mean, we have on this whole epidemic of gun violence in our country, because of the fact that the same old tired arguments get used all the time. We have twisted ourselves into a pretzel as to figure out why and what we can do to prevent it, when we don't have to. We don't have to twist ourselves in a pretzel. We can say that it's, again, there's a lot of systemic issues that may create this conditions, but I think the issue really comes down to access to weapons. And as I say to people who always keep claiming everything's a mental health issue, I'm like, well, if you believe that, even though, you know, the crime that, the issue that comes forward as soon as somebody pulls a gun, is there a murderer at that point, is that, you know, they're just going to continue to do that anyway. So I don't want to keep going because I know we've got just a short amount of time, but it just, to me, it just comes down to we're letting the people who are opposed to this, to solutions on the table, to twist ourselves and our country into this debate pretzel, when we know that, you know, there are clear, tangible issues that we've done in Connecticut that can be done across the country that will reduce gun violence.
Well, and so Senator, does a limit on the access to guns extend to, say, law enforcement? We have a question from Miriam, another Canadian actually, wondering about an example such as England, where cops aren't even armed with guns, except for very few exceptions. What makes the US a place where that kind of outcome is possibly unthinkable?
You know, Seamus was talking earlier about all of the sort of consequences of this epidemic that we don't talk enough about. And one of the consequences of this epidemic is that more and more kids are going to school in sort of buildings that feel more like fortresses. And, you know, I have had mixed feelings about this phenomenon. I have, of course, supported increased protection for kids, but what has often come with that is uniformed police officers in our school carrying guns. And what has come with that very often is a lot of kids getting arrested in our schools. And so there's not been a lot of examples of police officers stopping mass shootings. There's a whole lot of examples of kids getting arrested for talking back to their teacher and ending up with a criminal record. Similarly, you know, I think it's sort of the moment to have this conversation as to, you know, what level of law enforcement do we need out there, right? Do you need, you know, police officers with guns responding to, you know, traffic stops, for instance, right? I mean, I live in a low-income neighborhood in Hartford, and I was out for a walk the other day, and a guy got off a bus, a commuter bus stopped and let this guy off because he was having some trouble breathing. The first responder to him when he got off that bus was a police officer with a gun. And he just sort of got a little agitated about that, right? And I stopped and waited to make sure everything was okay. But you know, why was that the response to somebody who's having a health incident? So sometimes when you respond with an armed individual, either to school misbehaviors or to health emergencies, things can go wrong, as we have seen. And so this does sort of merit a conversation as to, you know, what level of law enforcement needs firearms and which don't. We're not going to go to an England style where no police officers have weapons. This country wouldn't permit that. But certainly there could be some conversation about a hybrid.
I'd like to jump in on that for just a quick second and address one other aspect of Miriam's question. One of the reasons that there were 3 police shootings in Great Britain last year, as opposed to I'm not sure how many in the United States, is certainly the fact that police are less armed. But the reason police are less armed, that was not always historically the case. The reason police are less armed is because, and the late Justice Scalia conveniently omits this part of it in Heller when he discusses the English common law that led into a great degree to his decision, is that the populace isn't armed. It's a question of where do you begin the conversation, is what I was referring to earlier. One aspect of having an armed populace is that you have a fearful, trigger-happy, sometimes, police. So I think it's a question of where does it begin? And I think that goes back to a very great extent to what Senator Duff was talking about.
Absolutely. And so as a final question then from Jennifer on that same note, and we can go around to hear from each of you to finish off our event this evening. As we continue on, what can the general public do to help eliminate the epidemic of gun violence?
Well, I'm happy to start because my answer is always the same. I exist in the world of politics, as does Bob, and I'll just sort of end where I began, and I won't belabor the point. From my perspective, it's about political power, and the groups that have organized since the Sandy Hook shooting, groups like Moms Demand Action, or Giffords, or Sandy Hook Promise, Newtown Action Alliance. They have changed the calculus in Washington. It used to be, and Bob will remember this because we sort of got into politics at the same time. If somebody approached you to talk about guns, as you were knocking doors or you were at a fair, when we both got involved in politics in the sort of late 90s, we knew which side they were coming from. There was nobody coming to talk to me about increased gun regulation in the 90s and 2000s. Everybody that wanted to talk to me about guns wanted to talk to me about eliminating restrictions on gun ownership. Today, that's not the case. If Republicans are at a town hall meeting and somebody brings up the topic of guns, it is more likely to be somebody that's arguing for background checks or bans on assault weapons. And over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but over time, that changes your psychology as an elected official. If every single town hall you do, you have to deal with this issue of why you're continuing to vote against universal background checks. And you're not super comfortable with that answer inside to begin with. Every single time you have to repeat that, it makes it harder and harder for you to justify it. And it makes you more and more sort of open to the idea of compromise, which is why we have a shot, which is why I'm in negotiations as we speak with Republicans about a bill that couldn't have passed 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So that's my answer. Join one of these groups, show up to a town hall meeting, send a letter to your congressman. Don't think that just because you're in a red state, you can't have an impact. Just lowering their volume level in the current conversation, even if they don't vote for it in the end, is a difference maker. So that's always my answer.
Yeah, I would just say, well, a couple things. One is that I've really enjoyed this discussion, so thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure to be a part of it. Two is that there's 2 out of 3 of us who've written a book, and one of us hasn't, so I guess I got to get working on a book. And I would say that, my answer largely mirrors Chris's in the sense that, it's really important for people to speak up and use their voice, get involved in Moms Demand. In Connecticut, we have Connecticut Coalition Against Gun Violence. There's Sandy Hook Promise, Newtown Alliance, all the others. And they're all very active in our state legislature, which is why we're able to get these bills passed in the first place. Because as I always tell people, in the political world, it's more than just to say, well, I told my state representative, I told my state senator this, I told them exactly what I think. Good for you, great, doesn't do anything. When I'm trying to charge up the hill, as the colonel in the army, trying to fight to get something done, when I look back, I need to have the army behind me to help me get up the hill to be able to, go on to that and fight to win and to get things done. And if you don't have anybody there with you to support you, and you're just fighting it on your own, you're not going to win. So that's why it's important for people to speak up, to be involved. You don't have to, not everybody has to run for office or be elected, though we certainly encourage that. but all we need is your presence, your voice, your name, all those kinds of things to help really grow a group and grow an alliance, grow grassroots to make change, make positive change.
I'm going to echo what the senator said. I am a 62-year-old white guy with terrible teeth who lives in a semi-rural community and owns guns. And in that makes me pretty much your typical gun owner. I am also somebody who favors tighter regulation of particularly deadly firearms. And in that makes me, again, emblematic of the community that I come from. And yet, our voices have not been heard. There is a line that I use repeatedly in the book. There is no silence on earth deeper than the silence between gunshots. It's deafening. It drowns out everything else. It is time, past time, for people like me to break our silence.
Well, thank you all for joining us for this event. We had a wonderful discussion, and as Seamus said at the beginning, the conversation does not end here. His contact information is in the chat. Feel free to reach out to him to continue this discussion. Senators Murphy, Duff, thank you so much for joining us this evening as well. From a Taller Tower is on sale now. You can pick it up at RJ Julia in Madison or in Middletown, or online. Links will also be in the chat. And of course, Senator Murphy's books, we have signed copies available at both stores of The Violence Inside Us. You can check his book out at both locations as well. And again, Senator Duff, thank you so much. We'll be waiting for when your book comes out.
Thank you, Seamus. Thanks, Bob.
What's that?
I'll pre-order it now, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.